Hello guys, and welcome to the first and inaugural installment of what we're going to call NeuroLIFE Skills. My name is Dr. Michael Longear. Dr. Dominic Federley will be with you every month that we do this, and we have our special guest for this week is Dr. Gilles LaMarche. In our NeuroLIFE Skills, what we want to do is get a little bit nerdy, but talk about how brain and neuroscience and all of the research that comes out on pretty much a daily basis on the brain and neuroscience is describing how a lot of the things that we take for granted in our world kind of impact us and how it changes the way we interact and understand our world. So neuroscience is a lot of fun right now. It changes daily. Our understanding of the brain kind of morphs and changes with every research article that comes out. But there's also these kind of core beliefs that we have that wrap in and intertwine around all of that stuff. And so what we want to do is every month is kind of bring somebody on and talk through what their core beliefs are, and then talk about how that ties into neuroscience and neurology. You know, there's some really fascinating and interesting things out there. There's some big topics. We're going to get into a really big topic for our first one here today. As one of my mentors and good friends and somebody who's impacted my life, especially with what he's going to talk about now, really kind of plays into this. And with where our world is and all of that, I don't think we could have had a better first discussion on how to come out of where we're at with a lot of these things. So we're going to get pretty nerdy. We might throw some, what I always refer to as $13 neuro words out there in our discussion, but we want to keep it fairly conversational too. But understanding how the brain works and how our brain determines what it is we see in our world a lot as well, and ultimately then how we respond and react to that. So without further ado, this is Dr. Gilles LaMarche, and he's going to speak to you. He's the vice president here at Life University, and he's going to speak a little bit on purpose.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here with both of you, and as you know, speaking on purpose is really one of my favorite subjects. And when you look at, there's been a lot of research done across the world as it relates to happiness. And typically what comes out of these research studies, and particularly a few of them that were done here in the United States, show that 80% of Americans are unhappy. Wow. At least 80% of the time. And I was like, how could that be possible? I think we were put on this earth to thrive and not to just sort of survive. And I've read a lot of that research, and I questioned why people would be so unhappy. And we can say unhappy or just not happy, right? So there's a difference. You can say, well, you know, somebody is down and out, they're depressed, they are unhappy, or other people are just living a life that's either like negative, neutral, where there's just no feeling, or they're like majorly stressed in sympathetic tone. What I discovered in many years ago through great mentors was the power of living a purposeful life. And what does that really mean? Well, the contemporary business speaker and consultant Simon Sinek talks about why. And he says that most companies and most individuals know what they do in the marketplace. Most of them also know how they do it, right? What they do is the product they sell or the services they offer, etc. He says most of them know how they do it. But he says very few, this is after tons of research, very few individuals and very few companies know exactly why they do it. So when I speak often to large groups or small groups, and I'm talking about purpose, I'll say, so how many of you have a clearly defined written purpose statement for your life and for your business or practice, if I'm talking to healthcare practitioners? I will tell you that typically the percentage, and it's a straw poll, right, because I'm paying attention to the audience, the percentage is less than 5%. So those who put their hands up, I say, okay, now keep your hands up for a minute. I said, of those who have your hands up, how many of you, if I asked you to, and I won't because I'm not going to embarrass anybody, but if I asked you to, how many of you could come to the front of the room and recite your purpose statement verbatim, exactly what you got written? I said, if you can, keep your hand up. If you can't, put your hands down. Boom. Most of the hands go down. So you'll get about 5% of people who who tell you, yes, I have a purpose statement, but very few of them can actually repeat it. So why is purpose important? Well, I'm going to take you down a road to I think a 4th century philosopher by the name of Patanjali. And I learned about him, and I learned from him through a mentor that has since passed on, by Dr. Wayne Dyer. And I think you had met Wayne at one point in your life, and Wayne was a great mentor. And he shared something that Patanjali had shared in his writings. Somebody had apparently asked him one day, why is having a purpose for your life so important? And apparently Patanjali went on to say, because purpose inspires you. And when you're inspired by some grand purpose, think of these words, and I'm going to come back to them, but when you're inspired by some grand purpose, your thoughts break their bonds. First sentence, think about that. Your mind transcends limitations. Your consciousness expands in every direction. You find yourself in this new, great, wonderful world where dormant forces, faculties, and talents come alive. You didn't say you find them. You already have them. Yeah. Right? Dormant forces, faculties, and talents come alive, and you discover yourself to be a greater person by far than you ever dreamt imaginable. Now, unfortunately for the majority of us, most of us were raised by great parents who probably told us to don't talk too loud, don't make too much noise, don't create too many waves, don't be boastful. And we all thought that living a purposeful life would mean that we were boasting. That if we used all of our gifts and all of our talents, and we spoke out our purpose, we proclaimed our purpose, that we'd be boasting. So most of us just decided to be quiet. That was me. I decided to be quiet until I had mentors who kicked me hard enough to wake me up and said, you got to find out why you were put on the planet. Why were you put here? Because each one of you in this room now, each one of you listening, were put on the planet for a reason. Have you found the reason yet? And if you have, are you living from that reason? Are you living from that why? So if we go back to what I just recited for you, paraphrased for you, when you have a purpose, you're inspired, right? When you're inspired by your grand purpose. He says your thoughts break their bonds. How many of you have ever been held in bondage by your thoughts?
Yeah, and I think most people have.
Yeah, they've been held bondage by their thoughts because they have these thoughts that speak to them and they think that's how they're supposed to behave. Then he said your mind transcends limitations when you're on purpose. Oh my gosh, how many of you have a little person sitting on your shoulder telling you, who do you think you are? You can't do that. You're not smart enough. You're not tall enough. You're not pretty enough. You're too old. You're too young. You're too whatever. And then people live their life from this, I should do this. I have to do that. Instead of living their life from, I want to, I get to, I choose to. Just a different paradigm. It's just a different thought process. It's just a different way to feed, I guess, your frontal lobe, which is probably what you would talk about, right?
Well, and we'll get into some of the different networks that are involved there, but I mean, really the brain in the way that it processes things, you said some just really kind of awesome nuggets already in what you've talked about with purpose and kind of waking up that dormant person you are and breaking the bonds. And you know, as neuroscience, like I said, it evolves on a daily basis. One of the big things that jumps in my mind is something called the Salience Network. And the Salience Network is what perceives your environment around you. It perceives what's going on. It takes in all of your sensory input, so to speak, and it processes how you're going to react to the world around you. So that first part of who we are is a collection of the sensory input that we take in. And so that Salience Network would be the part of the brain that is getting active that's breaking those bonds. That's kind of breaking down maybe the loop that you're caught in. If you hear me speak, I often talk of limbic loops, when an area of the brain called the amygdala, which is our fear center, can get really, really wound up and kind of run the show, as opposed to running from, like you said, the prefrontal cortex, which sees the big picture, realizes everything's going to be okay. Our limbic brain, when it gets in fear mode, will actually shut that frontal lobe down. And so the Salience Network is how you can kind of break those bonds. and get into some other areas of the neurology, right? And another one of those areas, again, what I love about neuroscience is it changes constantly. We've opened the door on this, what's called default mode network. And that's essentially who you are. So that dormant person that you talk about is your default mode network. And the Salience Network can break the bonds of the old you, essentially, and awaken or unlock that default mode network to come forward and really be what it is and present who you are in a different way, and shut down what we refer to as amygdala hijacking or amygdala escape. If you look at our world right now, that's what we're bombarded with. If you turn on the news, and before all of this other stuff was going on, the news was always about negative stories and fear, because it activates your brain a little bit more to pay attention, because we ultimately are worried about survival. So when we're just worried about survival and making it to tomorrow, we don't worry about thriving. We don't worry about being the best that we can be. But being the best we can be, that's that default mode network, that's that prefrontal cortex, but we don't activate that. And that's an active process, and that's something that we have to do on a regular basis.
And I think that's the awakening part, right? Because he went on to say, when your thoughts break their bonds and your mind transcends limitations, he says your consciousness expands in every direction. Like your awareness becomes completely different. You see the world almost like in a 360, and you see all these possibilities all the time. There's nothing that happens in my life that doesn't cause me to see possibility. I can hit a roadblock. Now, okay, what's the opportunity in the roadblock? Because there's an opportunity in the roadblock. But if we don't live a purposeful life, many people don't even understand, because nobody's ever explained it to you, that you can actually choose to sit by yourself in this beautiful, quiet space and say, so why am I alive? And it's not about, raising a child, though was a big part of my purpose, obviously. Mm-hmm. But I'm talking about to find a foundational purpose for your life. And I think I've shared mine with you, Dr. Lanier, before, but it's very simple. I pledge my life to my greatest expression of love and service for the benefit of humanity. So when I wake up in the morning, I recite those words. I lay there, and I was like, the first words I say, I will greet this day with love in my heart. It's a choice. So I prepare myself to greet the day with something good's going to happen. So my expectation is not that something bad's going to happen today. I set my intentions and my expectation that something's good is going to happen. So I say I greet this day with love in my heart, every person, every situation, every circumstance, because I choose to make my life sacred. And I might repeat it a couple times. And I did it again this morning in the sauna today, trying to help this voice a little bit. And then I recite my purpose statement. So I make that pledge. Who do I make the pledge to? I don't proclaim the pledge out there, though we're sharing it today. I proclaim it in here. I proclaim it to myself so that I can get to live my why. Because when I get to live my why, I get to serve people, I get to impact their lives, and in turn, they impact my life. I mean, it becomes this symbiotic relationship of we support each other because we have a reason to awaken. Mm-hmm. And, another piece of that, as you all know,
I talked about these this past weekend while I was up in Michigan speaking, your gratitude stones, and I mentioned you with these.
Yeah, so I keep one in my pocket all the time because, if I put my hand in my pocket, it reminds me to just stop for a second. I made a choice in the morning I was going to behave this way. If all of a sudden there's a crisis in the office or there's something that needs to be managed, I always need to bring myself back so I can be centered. So I am living my life by I choose to think and behave a certain way. And that's when we talk about, life is a choice. Where you're at in your life right now is based on all the choices that you have made so far in your life. And you might say, yeah, but you don't understand. You didn't have my parents, you don't have my wife, you don't have my husband, whatever it might be. But at the end of the day, through that, you made choices. If you made choices based on survival, the choices will be different than if you make the choice because you want to thrive. And for those of us who have learned, again, through great mentorship, reading great books, attending great conferences, who have learned to live a purposeful life, we make our choices so that we can thrive. You look longer term than just dealing with the crisis, and you come to every opportunity with intention. So my intention is always to do good.
Yeah.
So how am I going to do good now? I just hit a wall. I just hit a crisis. Somebody's upset at me because I may have said something. But I just have to go back in, focus on my why, my purpose, and go, how am I going to handle that now to have the outcome that I'd like to have, which is to end the day in the same state as I chose to start it in. Right? If I choose to greet the day, I want to end the day and go like, wow, even though there were challenges today, you did good. Right? I don't need to hear it from anybody else.
Right.
I need to know that the conscious decision I made in the morning was strong enough and done with commitment enough that I got to behave that way all day long, and I can end my day before going to sleep in a state of gratitude, so I can go into my rest and digest phase and awaken in the morning ready to do it again, and have fun.
Yeah.
So it brings us back to the initial topic of happiness that I started with. Happiness is self-inflicted.
Absolutely. You choose to be happy or you choose not to. And that's where, you often hear Dr. Dom and I talk about health is an active process. Everything that Dr. LaMarche just said, he chooses to, he does this. It's not always the easy decision. The easy decision is to sit back and kind of passively let the world smack you in the face and then blame everything else for it, right? But that doesn't activate those networks in our brain that allow us to transcend our problems, and I love how you use the expansive part, right? And expand beyond what we thought were our boundaries or limitations. I think limitations on us are put on us by us. I don't think, I think as we move forward in neuroscience, and I love the idea of quantum neuroscience and quantum physics and things like that. If you look at guys like Joe Dispenza, Greg Braden, and all those guys, I think our limitations are just self-perceived. I don't think we have any, and as we further move forward and begin to understand how to unlock the brain and different parts of our body and our heart centers and all of that kind of stuff, I think you're truly going to see how living a purposeful life and going at each day with the intention of getting better, doing better, and being better is going to unlock parts of us that we never thought possible. And I think something that we talk a lot about too is this idea of, and I've watched you do this, I've watched you do the hard thing because you knew it was the right thing, and I was like, man, that's really tough, like he's gonna pay for that. And you didn't pay for it, it rewarded you in the end.
You reap the benefits, right?
Yeah, and that's kind of what we talk about is this building a cognitive reserve or building cognitive resilience. If you look at a guy like Viktor Frankl, who wrote a book on man's search for meaning, here's a guy who was, if you haven't read the book, you need to read it. But
Absolutely agree. That is a must read at the top of your list. No matter how many books you actually have on your desk or your nightstand, that is the one book you want to raise to the top.
It's a quick read. It's like a weekend kind of thing. But what he talked about was understanding the purpose in the suffering while he was in a concentration camp. And he's developed this whole program about building cognitive resilience and cognitive reserve. And Dr. Dom, if you could talk just a little bit about what cognitive resilience and reserve are.
So part of the concept of conscious choice in general, and I love that you use that, is this idea of making a decision. Because a lot of what we do, at least has been shown in research, 15 to 27 times, if I go to reach and do this, I've already perceived it. I've already run through the loops of, oh, last time I did something like that, this is what happened. Or my previous experience is this. Therefore, maybe I stop and don't do that. Well, with motion in general, we also tie emotion and thoughts. So let's think about it from that perspective. Most thoughts that have come to the forefront of my mind have gone through a loop 15 to 27 times before I realize I've had that loop. So how important is this self-talk that you've given, or this conscious way to start your day or even end your day? So you're checking back in with your frontal lobe and saying, yes, okay, even though my normal negative thoughts might be this, I can overcome that and retie to my purpose, to that fire that drives. So I think that's great in the way that that was described and how that tied in. One of the ways that we see in here in the clinic is how can we build the capacity or the fuel in the tank so that we can break those loops? And we kind of call that concept cognitive reserve. In cognitive reserve, how it originally started was back when we start looking at our likelihood of developing these diseases, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's, dementia, what's the difference between one person getting a head injury and being much more predisposed versus another person? And we think of it in a way of, well, what is their normal processing speed? What is their normal cognitive ability? What is their awareness of what's happening? And sometimes for people, it's not a active, conscious choice. The purpose isn't quite completely built all the way, so their life is being run by these automatic choices. So really, one of the goals that I see in our clinic here is how do we build to add to somebody's ability to make those conscious decisions to further enrich their life in a way that they can leave here and it's more therapeutic for them. Everything in your world has the opportunity to be therapeutic. And I think that's a really cool tie with Viktor Frankl's book and Man's Search for Meaning, because really, I mean, this guy, he really had the odds against him here. I mean, he was a survivor in a concentration camp. It doesn't get any darker than that. So when we talk about, wow, how is this guy able to create this purpose and drive and influence these people and have the intention from his heart to expand and get all this good out of something that seemed so terrible? And I think that really having that example, saying, okay, well, there's still the ability to tie back in cognitive reserve and this conscious decision and drawing it together so that we can actually break that negative loop of, well, I guess this is it. I guess this is my life. And we see it in here so often to the point where it gets to be fun seeing that unravel. And once people's cortex is able to communicate back to themselves and open up into that default mode network of who am I, how do I tie this into the big picture, and how do I use that therapeutically, it gets to be a lot of fun. Absolutely.
Because that choice piece, like the next line as it relates to potentially, he said, your consciousness expands in every direction, and you find yourself in this new, great, wonderful world, right? It was already there, but you weren't living in it. You find yourself in this new, great, wonderful world where dormant forces, faculties, and talents come alive. And what he meant by that is that all of you have something special inside of you. And change can occur if you make the conscious choice. And when I walked in, I shared with the docs, what do I do with my phone? Oh, I'm gonna grab my phone for a second. Because I think this speaks to where we're going.
Absolutely. And
So-
I was going to tie this back in anyway.
So this morning, as I was driving here, I received this beautiful text from a young woman who used to be my executive assistant. We've not worked together since 2012, but this is an impact, and I'm sharing with you because I thought, okay, this just came from above. I was driving when the text came in, coming to do this interview, and it came in, and she says, she started working with me, she was 29 years old. She was a young woman, very, very brilliant. She said, yesterday I had to present at work and explain someone who has made a tremendous impact on me. That person is you. She puts a big red heart at the end. Thank you for being a light in this world and an example for so many. Your authenticity is a breath of fresh air. I'm so proud to call you my friend. And this was a woman who came with a vision of herself that was this wide. I saw the potential in her, and I fed into her, and I shared this information. I want to, I get to, I choose to. You can choose to not live your life in a, I should do that, I must do that, and always live in obligation. And I shared that with her, and she just blossomed. She just blossomed and became like this amazing person, literally within a matter of a few months, and she continued to expand. And look, 2012, 9 years later, she sends me this text. She's living a fantastic life. She's at the top of the game in her career. She's at the top of the game with her children and her husband. And she says, all of it was because you allowed me to see that I could change. And I didn't share with her anything other than what I've already shared with you this morning. That's where it all started. But I was there to coach her through it on a regular basis when she needed a little bit of support. But she picked up on it. So if anybody's listening in and you think, well, it's the way I am and I can't change, that's not true. And I think you can prove on the neuroscience side that that is not true.
Right.
Change occurs if you make the conscious choice. And it's not to eliminate something, but what do you want to replace it with? What new neural network do you want to build? And I'd love for you to share that
Yeah, so, and this is perfect, because this is where I was going to jump into with this as well. What he doesn't realize too is he says, well, I shared just this with her. But, you know, what you do also is you live by example. And so much of what we do is actually done without words, right? If you, depending on what research article you read, most of our communication, like what is it, 10 to 40% on the high end is verbal. And everything else, that means 60 to 90% of how we communicate is averbal or without words. It's body language, it's in mimicry and things that we do. And you live a purposeful life, and you always go that extra step, and you always do that thing. So her getting to work around you and see that, you have this bank of neurons in your frontal cortex near where that Salience Network kind of ties in, called near the anterior cingulate, which is your reward center in your brain. And it's where this special bank of neurons live called mirror neurons. We all see these in babies, right? If you make a face at a baby, they make the same face back to you. If you do a motion, they make the same motion back. And that's the brain literally mirroring and learning and making new networks, right? And that's what the word neuroplasticity really means, is your brain has the ability to wire itself over and over and over again for whatever you tell it to do, but also whatever you watch happening around you and what you surround yourself with. So that's what I think you were talking about, is that neuroplasticity. We have the ability to wire tracks. You often hear us say things that fire together, wire together. The more you do something, the more your brain will get really good at it. Now, that can be negative as well. That can happen with things like chronic pain or depression or those kind of things. But it also does happen with things like purpose. So for her, she had both things working for her. She got to watch you over and over again, unconsciously kind of mirroring what you did. And what I think is cool is we actually understand now that we mirror even what's not human. We literally mirror the sayings we see on a wall. We mirror, you know, if you're a doc watching this and you've got McDonald's on your countertop when the patient walks in, they're going to mirror McDonald's, right? They mirror everything, even inanimate objects or sayings on a wall. So, you know, what we put out to the world, what our purpose is, feeds everybody else as well. And it feeds their ability to neuroplastically wire their brain for the positive too. Because that's ultimately what we need to do, right? It's a conscious process, and it's hard, and it's really hard when you first start, because you're breaking old patterns, you're breaking old pathways. But the more you do it, the more you just kind of respond that way. You know, I had the benefit of going through something with Dr. LaMarche, the 7 advisors, and 6 advisors, and talking through each one of those things, you know, the see something, say something things. It was really hard for me at first. I remember the first time that I did it, I was on an airplane, and, you know, it was before we all had masks on airplanes, and the flight attendant was super nice, and she was super helpful to this other woman who was freaking out before we took off, and you know, she just kind of did her job. She calmed this woman down, and I walked up to her at the end of the flight, and I was like, you know, that was really awesome how you handled that person. You made her day, and you made everybody else's day easier, because she didn't freak out, so we didn't have to deal with her freaking out, you know, kind of all of those things. And you could tell it was maybe the only compliment she had gotten all week for doing her job, you know, and you could just see that light in her face. And then how far did that carry? You know, you started with, when you talked about Cheryl and what she wrote, you know, B.J. Palmer's saying of, you never know how far reaching something you say or do today will expand. And that's just it. Like, every little thing that we do, every ripple that we put into the pond has the opportunity to make huge change. And the same thing happens in your brain. Every ripple you put in, every new pathway you fire, if you continue to fire those things, they will continue to wire together, and they'll continue to make better, more neuroplastic, what we call long-term potentiation or long-term changes in the brain. And you'll continue to mirror things throughout life, and you'll continue to make those new pathways.
I'll tell you, I mean, if you want to start creating change, the number one suggestion I make to people all the time is that look for the good. You meet someone new, you interact with a flight attendant, look for the good. And when you see the good, say something about it. Say thank you.
Yeah, and that's really what we want to kind of leave with. Any parting words is, how do we actually begin to make this change from a neuroplastic point of view and literally rewiring the brain to, you know, just living with purpose. Are there any last parting words you guys want to kind of share with people?
I think I just gave you my parting words. Look for the good. When you see the good, say it. It's not about making a false compliment. It's about acknowledging something wonderful and allowing that person to thrive because of what you said to that flight attendant, for example.
Absolutely. And we're just so appreciative to have Dr. LaMarche here, because really driving that process is so reassuring in a sense that we can influence other people as well as our own purpose and create that self-talk in a way that it creates positive loops. And I love something that I've heard a million times, even Dr. Longer has shared, is practice doesn't necessarily make perfect, practice makes permanent.
Improvement.
I like that. So that's a perfect way to kind of end it, in a way that we can learn from it and know how to step into something that's a little bit more positive and a little bit more plastic.
Awesome. Thank you guys both for doing this. And join us. We're going to do this every month, and we're going to have a different speaker bringing what we kind of started with some different names. I really like the name NeuroLIFE Skills, but it's kind of like the neurology of things. We want to just bring, I won't say everyday things, but just some general topics, and then tie them into neuroscience and where we're at as a world, and how the brain and our understanding of it is changing, and really why it's so important to understand that. Because, you know, when we talk to doctors, I often say, whether you realize it or not, you're a brain doc, because whatever you're doing is affecting the neuroplasticity of your patient. It's affecting how they perceive the world, which ultimately it changes how they react to the world and respond to the world. And you going through life, if you're not a doctor, it's the same thing. Every person you come in contact with, both consciously and unconsciously, you're affecting how they see the day. And you're ultimately affecting then how they respond to the day and how they perceive it. So we all affect everybody's brain and everybody's hearts and everybody's everything. What we want to do is shed some light on how and why, and get a little nerdy with it and understand how the brain works a little differently. Thank you guys for joining us.